Hello friends, you are watching YouTube channel Parliamentary Reporter. This is English shorthand dictation number 181 and the dictation speed is 140 words per minute. Ready? Start. Sir, so far I have dealt with the arguments which have been presented against adult suffrage. Now let me put one or two arguments which I think are in favor of adult suffrage and which in my opinion are more or less decisive. The first argument that I will put is that you cannot have in India any system of suffrage short of adult suffrage which will give equality of representation to all the castes and communities in India. There is no other system you can devise for India which will give that result. Take for instance the existence of constituencies in Bengal and in Punjab. The Muslims form a majority of the population. You have in Sindh also, as apart from Bombay, the Muslims in a majority. Now what is the state of the Muslim community in these provinces? I am putting this as a feeler. My Muslim friends may take their stand apart from this. I am putting it as a case. What is the position of the Muslim community in these provinces under the system of franchise that we have today? The Muslims in Sindh form something like 70% of the population and yet their voting strength is only 49%. Take for instance Bengal and Punjab. There again the Muslims predominate in population and yet in the voting list they are in the minority. Take again the depressed classes. Under the existing franchise they are nowhere at all in the electorate. I think it is a most disgraceful thing to have a franchise of this sort. You have to remember one thing, that Indian society is composed of so many castes and creeds, and those castes and creeds are not related to each other in what one might call the vertical perpendicular, so that if you chop off this mass at any particular point, you get a part which is representative of all the communities in an equal degree. On the other hand, if I may put it so, they are related in such a manner that the parallel grains are placed horizontally one on the other, so that if you chop at any particular point, you get a part which is representative of one single community only, or at the most two, and the rest are not represented at all. Now surely you do not want to create a system of political government in which only some castes and some communities will predominate. Surely you do not want to create in India a South Africa where only some people will have the vote and the rest will not. If you are interested in giving every man the political franchise so that he may work out his destiny, then you cannot have any other system of franchise in India than that of adult suffrage. Now, let me give you another example. As I say, I am not opposed to female suffrage and I am very obliged to our lady colleague for supporting us in this matter. I will go with her wholeheartedly. Let me point out one or two illustrations of what has been suggested by way of enlarging and broadening the franchise. It is suggested that there should be a franchise of literacy. I do not propose to call it a fancy franchise, but let me tell you what will be the effect of it. The effect of it would be that some communities would have their voting strength almost doubled, while other communities would stand where they are. Literacy in India is so unevenly distributed that some communities would have all the increase of the franchise added to their stock, while other communities would remain where they are. Surely you do not want to create that sort of situation. Therefore, my submission is that if this conference and the members who are assembled round this table are true to their creed and believe that India must have responsible government and that government must be responsible to the people, then I submit there is no alternative to adult suffrage. There is one more consideration that I would like to point out. That seems to me to be a most decisive consideration in this matter. All of us know that the question of joint versus separate electorate is a thorny question. It seems to me to be a very crucial question. May I point out to this conference that, at least in my opinion, the question of joint versus separate electorates is inextricably bound up with the question of franchise. You will not ask any minority in India, you will not compel any minority in India, and you will not get the consent of any minority in India to agree to joint electorates unless that minority has adult suffrage. I am not going to place myself under the thumb and authority of any majority government unless I am certain that I can exercise in the elections electoral power, which is commensurate with my social power. Unless I know that every man and every woman in the depressed class community will be able to exercise the vote and to determine the destiny of the candidate who is going to represent the mass of people in the country, I am certainly not going to consent to joint electorates. I am not going to place myself in a minority position. I am not going to allow the majority to select my candidate under any circumstances, and I think what is true of my minority may also be true of the Muslims. I do not wish to say something that I shall have to say in another committee, but the point is so relevant that I cannot help making a reference. You cannot, in fairness, ask the Muslims of Bengal or Punjab to accept joint electorates unless you place them in a majority in the electorate. You cannot deny the franchise to the Muslims, make a minority of them in the electoral power, and then say, come along and have a joint electorate. The decisiveness of this fact was acknowledged by the Nehru Committee and by 3 members of the Indian Central Committee. Before I conclude, let me make 1 or 2 remarks to my friends who will not give us adult suffrage. I made it plain at the beginning of my speech that we make the question of the grant of responsible government to India not entirely dependent on this question. Although I know that my friend and I are only 2 in a conference of 80 or 90, we represent 43 millions of people. Sir, this morning I said what I need to say regarding the question of franchise, but without prejudice of what I have stated this morning, I should like to examine the suggestions which are put forward before this committee for the purpose of extending the franchise. I take it that this committee is agreed that the ideal is adult suffrage. Some of us think that it ought to be realized immediately. The rest of our friends think that it ought to be evolved by stages. We have therefore put before us 2 concrete suggestions. One suggestion is that we should adopt the system of installment and increase the suffrage by a graduated scheme of 25% addition to the existing voting list, say at an interval of a certain number of years. We have, on the other hand, the suggestion of our noble friend, in which also effect is sought to be given to some realization of this ideal of adult suffrage. Now, comparing the 2, I cannot help saying that I have a partiality for the suggestion of the noble Lord, although I hold strongly that we must have undiluted adult suffrage. If it were a mere matter of choice between the 2, I should certainly like to have a system which immediately lays the foundation of adult suffrage in preference to a system which gives some sort of suffrage to only a class of the people and postpones the fact of self-government to a large mass for a time to come. But having said that, I cannot give wholehearted support to the suggestion because I find there are certain difficulties, but because I think that probably the noble man will come to our help in meeting the difficulties which some of us feel, I propose to make 1 or 2 observations.